All right. You're recorded and you're going to get on YouTube. So if you're talking about your holidays, everyone will know about it. Good. Okay. So we talked about chance, which is basically random error. And now we're going to talk about systematic error. And bias differs from chance in the sense that the type of error that bias introduces is systematic. It's something in the design, either the way you collect the data, the way you interpret the data, the way you analyze the data. It leads to an outcome and a conclusion that is different from the truth. You either incorrectly estimating the exposure or the outcome, which means that your observation is either bigger or smaller or than the reality, or you reporting a difference when really there is no difference. So trying to graphically explain the difference between chance and bias. Imagine this is a target and you're shooting, right? You're shooting with a gun. And this is like this is what you're trying to get at. This is the truth. And like you shoot and enough times you like around the target, right? So, and this variation is due to you moving a little bit or not aiming right or something like that. Yeah, but if you do it enough time, the more times you do it, the circles will center around a certain value. And you can see here, this, this would be the real value. And this is like, every time you take a sample, it will be somewhere along these lines. This is the kind of normal distribution curve. And the blue line is the real value. And this is chance. This is how you need a big enough sample. Bias is something completely different entirely. Bias is something that there's something wrong with the gun when you shoot. The visor, whatever it's called, is somehow not calibrated properly, and you shoot very well, constantly the same, but you're just off target, right? And this is systematic, and it's a different concept. And these are two of the things that you need to exclude when you're conducting a study. And this is the hard bit, because even though with increasing sample size, you will reduce the risk of random error, the size of the sample does not impact on bias, right? So if you imagine, like, to give you an example, if you want to know the average weight of people, yeah, so you have a scale and you ask the person to go on the scale and you measure 75 kilos, 60, whatever. If you want to know, say, the average weight in all of Ziv employees, if you take enough people and your scales are working fine, you will get very close to the average. But if there's a problem with the scale itself, and it's systematically,
it's always too high.
Always too high. Of course, it's always too high. Yeah, I know. It doesn't matter whether you weigh 10 people or 1,000 people, your results will be wrong, right? So bias, in a sense, is a much bigger problem than sample size, because you can, with more money, or recruiting more people, more time, you can recruit more people. But if you design a study and there's bias in your study and you only realize afterwards, there's very little you can do about it, except for explaining in your paper that there was bias in your study, right? So it's really, really worth, and this is why spending time on your protocol, and one of the reasons we're doing this, it's really worth spending the time now to think about what are the potential biases in my studies. And we talked about it, like, for example, in your study, Tali, if you recruit people who, to running, who already like running or enjoy exercise, that's it's worth thinking about it now. All these things that could modify the results in a way that is systematic and wrong. So each of you need to think about that. There are many, many different types of biases. You can read, there's actually papers, if you look in PubMed, you know, list of biases, you will find papers that describe them. But basically you can divide them and summarize them in a few categories. The first one is selection bias, the way you select people. And the second one is information bias, the way you record the information, right? And then there's confounding, which we'll talk about separately. So let's start with selection bias. Selection bias occurs if you systematically, if there's a systematic difference between the people who participate in the study and those who do not participate. So if your sample is different from your population, or between the two groups that you're comparing. And if you remember, when we're doing cohort studies or case control studies, what did we say? We want if we're doing a cohort study, we want the two groups to be as similar as possible, except for the exposure. And in a case control study, we want the two groups to be as similar as possible, except for the outcome.
And then this question is, what is similar?
What is similar? Absolutely.
And if you know what to look for to see if they're similar. Those are the obvious things like epidemiology and stuff. But if you have something influences your question, you need to know to look for similarity.
In observational studies, you cannot completely eliminate bias. But your job is twofold. The first one is try and think about a little bit of bias. It's, you know, what you're really worried about is to overlook something so important that you know, it will completely change the results of your studies. If it's a small bias that will, you know, if you find that, a risk ratio of 2.5 and that without bias it would be 2.4, okay, it's not such a big deal. What you really want to avoid is to create associations that don't exist or completely miss associations that exist as a result of bias. So let's take a few examples. Let's go back to our first example of estimating the prevalence of coronary heart disease in the population, okay?
Maybe they have different habits. Maybe they're different age, the people who use smartphones.
So imagine that you want to know in the population, what is the prevalence of coronary heart disease? And you have a great idea. I'm going to go to the local hospital and I'm going to ask people on the wards about the history of coronary heart disease, right? People who are in hospital are not representative of the general population. They're older, they have more chronic diseases, they're more likely to whatever, smoke, etc., etc. Okay, so in that case, choosing a sample in a hospital to make inferences about the general population is a selection bias. It's a very basic examples, but it happens a lot, and it could be slightly less subtle than this. You know, like if you're doing, say, for example, a study in the population of Tzfat, and you select people in the lower part of the city and in whatever it's called, Naf Kinneret, you will get very different results. And you cannot necessarily make inferences about the whole population based on what neighborhood you select your people in, okay? The age, even the method of selection. Say, for example, you want to do a study and you make the invitation by smartphone. Well, you're going to exclude a whole part of the population that doesn't use smartphones, you know, and in a city like here, it's 30% to 30% of the population, which means that your results will not be representative. You have overrepresentation of secular people who, you know, have financial means, etc., etc. So it doesn't have to be as crude as hospital versus population. You need to think very, very carefully. Language can be you know, a big deal here. If you're only doing, you know, if you're doing a study on an elderly population and everything is in Hebrew, you're going to exclude, you know, all the Russian speakers or Arabic speakers or Amharic speakers. So, and that will, because these people all have different backgrounds, risk for diseases, it will influence the results, meaning that they will not be generalizable to the entire population. Mm-hmm. Right. So let's go back to our study that we started at the beginning of this session on smartphone and coronary heart disease, and you want to know, you still want to know what is, if there's an association between the two. You could take two approaches, which we saw in previous lectures. Either you start with the exposure, so you have a group of smartphone users and a group of not smartphone users, and you look at how many develop coronary heart disease, or you do the other way around. You do a case control approach, which is you take people with coronary heart disease, without coronary heart disease, and you look at the odds of smartphone use, okay? So whichever way you do it, you will end up with 4 groups, yeah? People who are exposed and have the disease, people who are exposed and don't have the disease, unexposed and disease, and unexposed and healthy. So in your population, in your reference population, there is, if you divided your population into these 4 groups, you would get a certain proportion of the population in each of the 4 boxes, right? And that's called a sampling fraction. And basically, what you should aim for is that in your sample, the relative proportion are the same than in the real population. If you systematically have more people in one box than another, and the proportions are systematically different, then that means you have some kind of bias. That is one way to understand bias.
But if in the population there is a bias?
No, the population is the truth.
No, you're saying that if in one of these 4 quarters you always have different proportion, right? This is the real distribution in your population, okay, which you don't know. But you don't know. You don't know, of course. So I didn't get the sentence with the systematic difference in. What you should aim for in your sample is that the distribution, the relative proportion, are the same than in your real population. But of course, you don't know what it is in your real population. So you cannot, these numbers, you wouldn't know them in real life. Okay. But you have to think, what are the things in the way I design my study that could lead me to put people in the wrong boxes? Yeah, for me, I thought that from these numbers, I can assume. No, you never know. I know. Otherwise, it would be very easy. Right? So again, imagine we're doing a case control study to know the association between smartphone and coronary heart disease. And you take your cases from Sfat and your controls from Nahariya. Right? That could be a problem. Why? Because you have more Haredim here that don't use smartphone. It doesn't mean that they're helping. So the actual prevalence of the exposure is different in your cases than in your controls. So already it's probably going to influence the results. Exactly like you said, in this particular example, your cases are more likely to be Haredi and less likely to use smartphones. So this is selection bias, and it's really, really important that you think about that when you choose your cases. You know, if you're doing and this is often you will, you know, in bad studies, you will see this, that, for example, if you're doing a cohort study, you want to see clinical outcomes in 2 groups, that the group without your intervention have a poor prognosis. You know, in oncology, it would be a common thing, you know, a poor prognosis to begin with. So of course, you're going to see worse outcomes, not as a result necessarily of the treatment, but because these people started with more advanced disease, or, you know, so you have to really, really watch out for these things. Or, you know, same with surgery, you know, there will be background factors that mean that's your likelihood of dying on the table or having a poorer outcome. You know, if there's more diabetics in your control group, they're less likely to heal well, etc., etc. All these things, you need to measure as many of these things as possible. And what you need to do when you do your study is to convince the reader and the reviewers in the journal that what you found is really due to the factor that you're looking at, not due to other not due to other factors. And this is why, again, the first table that describes the characteristics of your population is really, really important. Because, you know, if I'm looking at a paper on
surgical outcomes with intervention A versus intervention B. I want to make sure that you're not seeing the difference because one group is older, is more diabetic, is more smoking, etc., that could influence on the outcomes. So when you start, you need to think, what variables do I need to record? What things do I need to look for? And sometimes these data exist, sometimes they don't. If they don't, then what you need to do is to be open and transparent about it, and in your discussion, in your paper, to say, you know, we know that this is important, we could not measure it, and try to explain why your results are still valid. Yeah, like for example, say for example, you want to look at surgical outcomes, and you didn't measure the prevalence of diabetes in your population, which could lead one group to heal less well than the other. You would have to say, well, you know, there's no reason to believe, although we didn't ask people if they're diabetic, this is how we recruited patients, and there's no reason to believe that diabetes would be more common in one group than another, and therefore we don't think it's a cause of fight. If your data doesn't exist, and if you're doing a randomized controlled trial, it's easier because your patients come and you can ask them everything that you want. If you're working with existing data, which is often the case in hospital, you have what you have. You know, when you go back into your CTs, you have the information that you have. You can't go back to every patient for the last 10 years and ask them all the things that you want to ask them. You just have to work with what you have. This is the reality, but you need to be aware of the own limitations of your data. This is really important. Yeah? So now let's talk about information bias. And information bias is errors in measuring whatever you're measuring, exposure, disease, or both, which means that you could end up putting people in the wrong category, right? So exposed people in the unexposed group, people with the outcome in the non-outcome group. And it could be due to three things. The first one is the observer, so the researcher himself, putting the patients in the wrong category, the participants, or the instruments or the tool that you're using. So the scale is a good example. You know, if you want to classify people into obese and non-obese, if the balance doesn't, if the scale, sorry, doesn't weigh people correctly, you will classify people wrongly. Okay, and this is getting a little, just if, in case things are not complicated enough, you can, the misclassification, the putting people in the wrong category can either happen randomly or not randomly. And we'll talk about these two. We're going to start with non-random, with randomly, sorry. Right, so let's now take an example of a study looking at the association between smoking and lung cancer. Okay, so here we're doing a cohort study. We have a group of smokers, a group of non-smokers, and we find that in the smoker group, there are 3 people who develop lung cancer, and in the non-smoker group, there is 1 person who develops lung cancer, and therefore the risk ratio is 3, right? So people who smoke are 3 times more likely to develop lung cancer, right? Now let's imagine that for some reason, and we'll explain how this can happen, some of the smokers ended up in the non-smoking group and some of the non-smokers ended up in the smoking group, right? And in this swap, one of the lung cancer patients ended up in the other group. Suddenly, what do you have? A risk ratio of 1. Why did they swap? I will show you in a second. Because in the way you measured smoking status, either you as an observer measured it wrong, either the patient lied, or, well, I mean, for smoking, you wouldn't have an instrument issue, but something in the way you measured the status went wrong. I know it sounds strange, but you'll see. I'll give you some examples. So how do people end up in the wrong group, which is your question? Yeah? Well,
I didn't pay attention.
Well, maybe, well, that would be an instrument error, but let's think, for example, something more, say, for example, I don't know, you had some, for some reason you are doubtful about
smoking is not binary. So if you say you just define smoking by is not 10 pack years or 40 pack years.
Exactly. So first of all, generally you make categories, right? But the reality is that there's a spectrum. Smoking 1 cigarette a day is not the same as smoking 3 packs a day.
Used to smoke.
Maybe. Nargila is even worse than cigarette. But anyway, you know, maybe you have, but let's say you decided to define smoker or non-smoker as a binary thing. Just either you smoke. If you smoke anything, you're in the smoker category. If you don't smoke at all, you're in the non-smoker category. But maybe you have a patient and he's like, oh yes, he's only smoking 1 or 2 cigarettes a day. I'm going to put him in the non-smoker category, right? Because it's really not a lot, and everyone else. Okay. Study participant. Imagine you have doing this study and you're working with people in a group that, you know, smoking for women is really socially unacceptable. And when you're doing the questionnaire, your patient is there with her husband and she's smoking in secret. Maybe she's going to say, no, of course I don't smoke. Possible, doesn't sound completely unrealistic. Maybe you did this study really late at night after a very long shift and you put a 1 instead of a 0 in your software and all the non-smoker people went into the smoking category or vice versa.
I see this now because I'm doing research and we have questionnaires that they were written in Canada and other places. It's a multi-center and I see people here in fact, they don't understand the questionnaire. You can see the answer, like I'm putting the answer they gave because I'm not changing anything, but going through their answers, I can see they don't understand what the questions mean. And I think a lot of their answers are just random because they want to satisfy us that they're answering, but they don't really understand the questions.
So that is called social desirability bias. Social desirability bias, when the participant wants to please the researcher by trying to give the right answers.
Or the right answers, or they just want to answer to fill the questionnaire, but they don't really understand what it says, and you see contradicting answers.
And what you can see in the researcher, well, that's maybe because the questionnaire is not designed well.
It's not designed well. I can tell you it's not designed well.
But so there's problem with the tools. There's problem with the observer. I've done this with, you know, many people do this. Anyone who works with questionnaires, you get the responses, and you look at the response and you think, oh, surely he didn't mean that. When he wrote this answer, he meant something else, right? So I'm going to change the answer.
So I'm not changing, but I can see that you have a bias because they don't give the real answers, because you don't understand it. It's not designed well. Not visually, not in the meaning of the question. It's too long, it's too confusing.
There's many things that you could think you would end up, say you did a questionnaire among teenagers and alcohol consumption in a Muslim village. You're not going to get truthful answers. Things that are not socially acceptable. People lie about them because they don't want other people to know. They're doing it in secret
to themselves.
Or to themselves. So you have to think about, so any of these, whether it's instruments, whether it's the person or the observer, you could introduce bias. So you can see now how you could end up. I know it sounds crazy that people end up in the wrong group, but you can see how it happens, right?
We talked about it in the depression, in the ER. Maybe the fact that she's sitting by herself and the husband didn't come from work to be with her in the ER. Now she's upset, she's lonely, she's always alone. Because it's that moment that she feels like that, not because she is
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Right? So generally, when you have when these things happen randomly, when people end up in the wrong group in all the directions, it leads to the association, to underestimating the strength of the association. So it's a bias towards the null. So what generally happens is that you fail to detect something when there is something. So you could see it in the lung cancer and smoking example, right? So you expect an association, you expect a difference. In reality, there is a difference, but because of the bias, you fail to detect it. That's why it's so important to plan to try and anticipate this. Now let's talk about non-random. Now, non-random is when one group is more prone to bias than another group. Okay? So a classic example is looking at the link between MMR vaccination and autism, which really caused a lot of damage. You know, this is a real thing that happened in the UK in 1997. It caused a lot of damage. It caused 1 in 5 parents of refusing to vaccinate their child with measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, right? So imagine a study design to answer this question. Case control study. Autism is quite rare. So a case control study is a good design, right? You start with kids with autism and controls without autism, and you ask the parents, did you vaccinate against MMR, against measles, okay? So imagine that you do a small study, 10 autistic, 10 non-autistic, and this is the reality, right? In each group, 8 were vaccinated and 2 were non-vaccinated. Odds ratio of 1.
There's no difference.
There's no difference. Let's assume this is the reality. Now, this is what you actually get when you do the studies. Among the autistic children, 8 said yes, 2 said no. Among the non-autistic children, 6 said yes, 4 said no. Now, why do you think that might happen?
Because people with autistic child are looking for all the reasons. They're very, very up to date with everything they've done before.
So I don't know how many children you have. I have 3 kids. And each of these kids had about 12 or 15 vaccines. I frankly don't remember whether my child had the flu vaccine 3 years ago or, exactly, sorry?
Your wife does.
Well, that is beside the point. Well,
that could be a bias.
It's a bias, and as you say, but if it's a recall bias, exactly. If my child, if someone had an autistic child or something, really severe, like a malignancy, like something really, really, really bad, you would look for every reason. You would remember every detail of what happened before his diagnosis, right? So people with the outcome are much more likely to remember the exposure correctly than the people without the outcome. And that leads to bias because the 2 groups have a differential likelihood of remembering the exposure. And you can see how even with very small differences now, with 2 people, this is in 20 people, 2 people failing to remember correctly the vaccination status of their child, we went from no effect to autistic children are 3 times more likely to be vaccinated against.
So way to overcome it is to, in this case, not in every case, you have to go to records.
Yeah. The case, and there's a lot of studies, but it's possible here. But when I've done this kind of work in Africa, for example, there are no records, or there's the WHO card, but people lose them, they get damaged. So there's actually studies that looked at the validity of oral history versus because you need to know if there's nothing else. What you need to know is oral history better than nothing? And sometimes it's not, because they remember a mix of the, try and ask a mother of 9 kids, which child received, was it this one that went to hospital? I mean, it gets confusing, especially 5-10 years down the line when you're looking at a very long delay between the exposure and the outcome, right?
Yeah, in Israel, you have a system of Tipat Chalal.
Yeah, in Israel,
if you're going regularly and if nothing happens, like,
So in many cases, for vaccination, you know, which is my field. In many cases, you don't accept. In many cases, you don't accept oral history as a proof. You want some kind of written evidence. Right. So we talked about recall bias, and recall bias happens because, as we said, cases spend more time and effort searching memories about what could have caused their disease. But if you're a control, you don't really have that incentive. And whereas non-random bias can lead you to fail to detect an association where there is one, here it's worse because here you can create associations that don't exist, right? Which leads you to completely wrong conclusions.
So what really happened in MMR?
Well,
what was the bias?
There were several things. There was recall bias. They actually like paid people to try and
fabricated.
Well, it was kind of semi-fabricated. But when you had when you had larger and well-conducted studies afterwards, which needed to be there was no effect, no such link.
But they paid them.
They did. They paid the parents. They looked for, you know, this is another thing. As an observer, if you look for something more in one group there than another, you will find it more often, you know. Like if you exactly. If you test your cases every week, but your controls only once a year, you know, you're going to find yeah. So there's ways that you can check. There's ways that you can check. So you really don't want to start a study that is biased. So the best thing to do is to check before you start. And this is an example of a checklist that you can look at. And if you need to answer all these questions to make sure that you're not going to introduce bias.
What about inherent biases that are part of the, let's say, the smartphone, and you asked about smartphones and heart disease, but the smartphone population is younger, or doesn't eat well because they don't respond because they're with a smartphone all the time. So you have a bias, but the bias is part of the package.
So some things you can,
It's not a sample.
Right, but then you say it's causative.
No,
I mean, it's not
you
causative.
say smartphone causes heart disease, but the reality is that people who use smartphone, they do less sports. So actually,
that's exactly
you're saying one thing, but actually the
so what
difference
you
is real.
that's a
The
confounding
difference
value.
We're
is
talking about confounding. This is not bias, this is confounding. We'll talk about confounding in a minute. Confounding is an alternative hidden explanation to the relationship, and that you can adjust.
So it's not a bias, but it's something you have to think about.
Correct.
When you see results.
And you can, yes.
It's not always what you see. Maybe there's a different thing.
We'll come to that. We'll come to confounding now.
Okay. I'm a lucky streak today.
I know. So bias, and sometimes it's not easy conceptually to understand the difference between bias and confounding. Bias is an error somewhere in the process, right? How the data is collected, measured, or analyzed. Confounding is about an alternative hidden explanation. So let's now look at alcohol consumption in lung cancer. Okay. So we have two groups. One group that drinks alcohol and one group that doesn't drink alcohol. And we find that in the group that drinks alcohol, we have one lung cancer, and in the group that doesn't drink alcohol, one lung cancer. In the group that drinks alcohol, 3 lung cancers. We can do the incidence of lung cancer in each group, and the risk ratio, which is 3, very low p-value. Okay. Do you think that drinking alcohol causes lung cancer?
We don't know. Maybe
not necessarily.
Maybe they smoke.
We know that the association is not due to chance. And let's imagine that we adjusted for biases. It still doesn't mean that it's a causal thing, because there may be an alternative explanation, right? And this is confounding. Confounding is another factor that you don't see when you just look at the association between exposure and outcome, that is associated both with the exposure and the outcome. In this example, simple example, drinking alcohol, especially high quantities of alcohol, is associated with smoking. A lot of people that are heavy drinkers are also smokers, right? Mm-hmm. And smoking is associated with lung cancer. It's more fun. So what you're observing here, the association between alcoholism and lung cancer is actually caused by this alternative pathway that is hidden. And if you don't ask about it, you don't know about it, right?
I don't know if you made this up, but I remember reading about coffee consumption. In the past, there was they found the association between coffee consumption and certain cancers, and then they corrected for smoking.
There was no effect. Yeah, exactly. So this is an important, a very common thing in the previous example that I showed you with the vaccination and ethnicity. When you correct for socioeconomic status, the differences get much, much smaller.
Right.
And it was very interesting that recently we did a study that came out about 2 weeks ago, where we looked at COVID-19 coverage between non-Haredi Jews, Haredi Jews and Arabs. And the Arab and Haredi population have a lower vaccine coverage than the non-Haredi Jews. Yeah. But when you adjust for socioeconomic factors, the difference between Arab and non-Haredi almost disappears. But the difference between Haredi and non-Haredi stays, which is really interesting, right? Which tells you that the reasons for lower vaccination are different.
Lower is because you need to make the immunization more approachable to them or something.
It could be. It doesn't tell you why, but it tells you that there's an alternative explanation that partly explains, not fully explains. And by the way, a confounder doesn't have to fully explain. You can have a lot of different confounders. Like, if you do two groups between, say you did, I don't know, you looked at
with our population, you can think about
heart disease between a poor Haredi town and a rich secular town, and you would see a difference in age maybe because one population is younger than the other. So if you adjust for age, you would see the difference getting smaller, but it wouldn't disappear completely. So a confounder doesn't have to fully explain an association.
You might have a few confounders.
You might have a few
confounders related
confounders
to each other.
Absolutely, and generally you have many confounders.
Like diet and sports.
And that's why generally you try to adjust for age and gender and ethnicity and all these different things that influence the disease pathway that you know about. But like Chobab said, there's many confounders that you don't know about, or you may know about it, but you can't really do much about because the data doesn't exist. Yeah?
Actually, I heard about all the time we talk about confounder, but I'm interested if there is like something opposite, like if you adjust for it and you're gonna have
a bigger effect. Absolutely, you can. So a confounder, you can actually see that the difference that you measure without adjusting for your confounder is actually smaller than after adjusting for confounders. Absolutely, you can. It's the same principle. It's like an additive effect. It depends on how well balanced your groups are. Mm-hmm. But yeah, absolutely. It's still called confounding. Okay. Confounding can it can reduce the association or increase the association.
But when I'm talking about confounding, I'm talking about something when we adjust for it, like the difference between groups is going to be more less significant, less.
No, it could be more.
It's smaller.
It would be different. It could be bigger as well.
Yeah.
It could be bigger as well. In order for a factor to be a confounder, it needs to be associated both with the exposure and with the outcome, right? So for example, a genetic mutation that predisposes you to lung cancer is not a confounder in this case because it's not associated with drinking alcohol. It's just an additional risk factor for your outcome, right? If you adjust for it, it won't make a difference to your association. So unlike bias, you can actually do something about confounding. And you can either do something when you design your study, which is the preferred option, or when you analyze your data. So what you can do in your design study is you can restrict, you can randomize, you can match. We're not going to go into the detail, and this is things that you should speak about with your mentors when you, but let's say, for example, you want to compare, again, let's take vaccination in ultra-Orthodox versus non-ultra-Orthodox. And you look at the entire population and you will see that there's a difference. And you'll say, oh, yeah, but the Haredim have much more children. So the distribution of the population is different, right? It's a confounder. So you can restrict, you can say, okay, we're only going to look at people between the age of 30 to 40. So you don't have this difference in distribution. This is called restricting your analysis. You can randomize if you're doing an intervention. You can randomize people to either the control or the intervention, and that will, if it's done well, will take care of the confounding. Say, for example, you have a population with a different age. If you randomize them on average, the age should end up being the same in the two groups. Or you could do it in the analysis stage. You can measure. You can do your study in your entire population, but you then divide it by a specific age group. This is what, I mean, I do that a lot. For example, now we're doing a study on the effect of COVID vaccination on long COVID, and we're looking in different, rather than looking at overall, because there are more older people that receive the vaccine than young people, we do it by age band. So you adjust for that through that. You can standardize, you can use a standard population. So when you see standard mortality rates, for example, you use a reference population and you adjust your finding, assuming the distribution of a standard population. It's another way. Or you can do more advanced statistics like regression modeling. And regression models, we're not going to go into detail, but basically it's a mathematical way to adjust for many confounders at the same time. So you have your two groups and you can adjust for age and gender and ethnicity and smoking status and whatever you want in the same.
But you need to know what might affect.
Yeah, it's only
Sometimes you measure.
So you only know what you know. What you there's this yes, there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. The unknown unknowns, the things you don't know about, you can't. There are things that you know about, but you cannot adjust for it because the data doesn't exist. Like, for example, you might do a study on time to wound recovery, and you know that being diabetic delays healing, but you don't have the data with diabetes. Nothing you can do about except for mentioning it in your paper and explaining why you don't think that it's such a problem. Right, so let's try and show you a real life example. We're doing the study on alcohol consumption in lung cancer, right? We're doing a cohort study, so we have our 4 boxes: people who drank alcohol, yes or no; people who developed lung cancer, yes or no. And we can see that the risk of lung cancer in alcohol drinkers is 20%, 1,000 out of 5,000. And in those who didn't drink alcohol, it's 50 out of 2,000, which is 5%, right? So the risk ratio is almost 10. Those who drank alcohol were 10 times more likely to have lung cancer than those who didn't. Now we think that there's a confounder, which is smoking. So what we did is we divided. So this is called a stratified analysis. We divided our alcohol drinkers into 2 groups: smokers and non-smokers, right? So in the first part, this is only people who smoke. Everyone smokes in this group. And then you do the same thing: those who drink alcohol and those who don't. And then if you do the math, you will see that the risk ratio is basically 1, right? 1.1 with a p-value of 0.2, which means that if you only look at smokers, there's no effect of alcohol. Likewise, if you only look at non-smokers, also you don't have. So once you adjust for your confounder, there is no effect. Right, so this gives you an example, and you can see that almost all the lung cancers are in the smokers group. There's only very, very few. You can do this through stratified analysis. You could do this through regression. Something to discuss.
What makes it more difficult is that you design a study and you design a sample size based on the outcome that you're measuring.
Yeah.
But then you have confounders. So then you want to do a stratified analysis, and you don't have enough power in each group of the study.
Correct. So this is why you have what's called primary and secondary objectives in your study, generally, right? You should power your study for your primary objective. So if you know that you're going to stratify, you should not do the sample size calculation on this, but you should do it on the smallest stratum that you have. So you know that you will have more power in the bigger analysis, but you will be powered enough to answer your main question, right?
Oh, that's why I never understood.
Generally, the secondary objectives, when you have kind of secondary outcomes, there are things that are nice to look for, but you're not necessarily going to have the power, because when you end up in very small groups, you're never going to have the power. So they're kind of more hypothesis generating. So, you know, the main question I want to answer is this question, because then you might want to know, but what about people who are exposed to industrial smoke, you know? What about them? And, you know, is it, so it's something that you could look at, but this is not the main objective of your study. You may have a few people in your study who have this additional exposure, but you're not necessarily going to have the power. So you could report on it, but you recognize that you may fail to detect an association. If you wanted to do a study on this, then you would power it just on this. Yeah? You have to know in advance. There's a lot of planning. There's a lot of planning. Absolutely. Right. So, when you're planning a study or when you're reading a study, you need to make sure that in your design, you've done things well enough to exclude chance, bias, and confounding. Chance is about random error, basically an insufficient sample size, which you can fix with a bigger sample. Confounding is about hidden alternative explanations, which you can adjust for either at the design or at the analysis stage. And bias is a systematic error in the collection, the analysis, the interpretation, or the publication. The reason I say publication is because if you look at systematic reviews and meta-analyses, if you're doing a study that has negative results, it's not exciting for a journal. They're less likely to publish it. So if you're looking at the literature, you're much more likely to successfully publish if you have a positive than a negative outcome. So when you're doing a meta-analysis, you end up having a bias towards an association, and you need to, and there are ways you can do what's called a funnel plot, and you can look, because again, you should see a distribution. By chance, you should see studies that haven't found an effect, even if there is one. And you can look at the distribution of the studies to assess whether or not there is publication bias. So it even goes all the way to meta-analysis, this issue of bias.
And therefore, in class, you ought to look for studies that were not published.
Correct.
How can you find it?
Very difficult.
That's the gray.
Yeah, exactly. Now it's become a little bit better, because first of all, there's for randomized. It's not just randomized controlled trials that are registered, by the way. Things like systematic reviews you have to register. A lot of observational studies are now registered, so you can get an idea. But also journals have become a little bit more aware of this, so it's become less of an issue, but it still is an issue. It still is an issue. It's very hard, because unless you're going to, look at every PhD thesis and thing around the world to find evidence that hasn't been published is very hard. Yeah. It's a lot of work. It's not impossible, but it's a lot of work. But it's important to be aware of it.
I think I saw that in the TED Talk. A very good TED Talk about unpublished studies.
Yeah.
That really changed the view of the treatment with certain medications. I think it was antidepressants. I think it was a very good talk.
Yeah. No, there were. I can't remember which one. There was some, like really well accepted dogmas. I think one good example was the oral contraceptive pill and risk of certain gynecological malignancies, which basically changed, breast and ovarian cancer after realizing that a lot of the evidence hadn't been published. So it can really, affect standard treatment just because some of the data is not published. So the bottom line is, when you look at a study, be skeptical. Think like you do in a clinic, like you examine someone, you want to exclude certain things. Well, here you want to exclude chance, you want to exclude bias, and you want to exclude confounding before you even consider a causal association. And when you design your study, think about designing it, think about the reader and thinking, will I give the reader confidence that I've thought about these things and excluded them? Right? So the things you need to think about is the observed group big enough for this question? Is the observed group representative of the population? Have the exposure and the outcome been measured and recorded consistently and accurately? Is there an explanation that I haven't thought of that can explain? And I think that's it.
So their self-work is